Hey, thanks for everyone for being flexible with me Saturday and for showing up tonight. What we do tonight was what we were going to do Saturday. I'm going to spend the majority of the time walking through a couple of things um, in regards to childhood. And so the way the class is going to be broken down tonight, and there's actually a PowerPoint on Moodle if you want that. Sometimes I know students like those. You can grab that if you want. Um, it's basically a compilation of a few chapters, just information from early to late childhood. And we're going to talk about different aspects of that. But we're going to mainly focus on some of the clinical pieces of it. And we'll do at least one breakout group with everybody, maybe two, depends on the time. And then at the very end, um, what I thought we would do is I'm going to go over or talk about the midterm, but I'll do that kind of like the last 10 or 15 minutes. I've had a few questions about it. I've tried to answer those in the messages, but I'll answer those for anyone that has them. Um, we'll do that, kind of, like I said, towards the end. Uh, I've started grading the second exercise. I should have those done by the end of the week for sure. And there we go. Just trying to move some stuff out of the way. Okay. All right. So, like I said, if you want to grab that PowerPoint slide, please feel free to do that. Um, I'm not going to, that slide's laid out for you to just have information. I'm not going to follow it like slide by slide here. It's really just for you to have the information. I am going to hit a few things there um, and talk through a couple of things, but I just wanted to give you some more information if that would be helpful. And so um, I'm going to spend about probably 20 minutes just going over a couple of things. Then we're going to have some discussion, and we'll we'll have some of that kind of as we go. But one of the things that I usually talk about, and I'll probably talk about this again in other classes, um, lifespan development in terms of the way in which humans develop, and whether it's biologically or cognitively, socio-emotionally. Um, the major milestones in the way in which we develop hasn't changed a lot. Like there hasn't been like significant changes to how it happens for quite some time. However, the environment and the culture and the environment and um, that we live in has changed drastically, especially in the last 20 years. And that's continuing to happen. So, one of the things that we'll talk about as we go through is kind of how that plays a role in um, human development. Um, and so, like, we'll talk a little bit about this tonight, but more so when we talk about adolescence, we'll talk a lot more about uh, social media and screens and things like that. We'll talk about it a little bit tonight, but we're going to really hit it a lot when we get into adolescence and even into adulthood, because that's probably the one area that's probably changed our culture the most, or at least the most rapidly. And so there's some things that have been true for a few hundred years. Things like if you look at intelligence, for example, um, the average intelligence quotient has been rising over the past few hundred years. Um, biologically, like how tall people are, like certain physical attributes have changed over the past several hundred years. And obviously, some of that's dependent upon ethnicity and gender and culture. In some places in the world are different than others. So there's a lot of variables to it. But in general, if we look at it long term, there's some places in our world that have changed pretty drastically in the environment, but how we um, develop hasn't changed a lot. And so the one thing that that definitely hasn't changed as much if we when we look at childhood, and this will start kind of early childhood, so coming out of infancy into the toddler years, there's there's a couple of big milestones that need to happen. And the first one is this kind of view of self. So when you have a view of self in childhood, the next step is in adolescence, and that's your self identity, which actually falls, kind of spills over into adulthood. But that view of self is very important. So kind of things like um, understanding this is going to sound weird, but understanding you're a person and understanding there's other people around you. Because when you're coming into toddlerhood, you begin to notice those things, and that's important. Um, and you become more psychologically sophisticated as you grow older, um, and you start to have like a conception of yourself inside that environment, whatever that environment is. Um, and when we think about that, then we can start, as clinicians, we can start thinking about how, the adults in their world would start looking at them, or how they would interact with them. Um, and so, one of the areas that I would say, at least for me clinically, probably over the last 10 or 12 years, when I work with couples that, let's say, have, their first baby, let's say, um, you know, obviously everyone knows that to change and there's going to be adjustments you have to make. I mean, everybody knows that. The information is not really an issue. We kind of know that's going to happen. What really, I think, what I find myself talking with clients about a lot is, I guess, a couple of things. The first thing is uh, sometimes the way that they were raised and the environment they came from starts to come to the surface. And if those environments were different for those two partners, that can be something that they might have disagreements about. In other words, like how to parent, or how to do certain things or not do certain things. That can happen. And then the basic, just some basic things like, as children get older, um, they have a basic understanding of like emotion, like how they feel. They kind of know, but they don't necessarily have the words yet or vocabulary to, put with certain emotions that they might feeling about me feeling. So they might act out, or they might do something else to try to get those emotions across. And that can be something that is hard for parents to understand and work through, and that's pretty common. One of the reasons why I'm bringing this up is because one of the first emotional markers that is important, and this is going to sound a little bit strange, but one of the first emotional markers that's very important for human beings is the feeling or the emotion of guilt. When we start feeling guilt, then we become aware of not just ourself, because we feel it, but we become aware of other people. And there's really basically two kinds of guilt that we are talking about. There's guilt where, I did something wrong, I said something wrong, um, and I need to make amends for it. I need to repair something. I need to say I'm sorry. And when we do that, we're basically, okay, we can kind of move on. The second kind of guilt is something that happened maybe to me, but it really wasn't because of me. Like I didn't do it, but I'm made to feel as though I did. And that kind of guilt is the one that tends to stick with people long term. And so it wouldn't be uncommon to work with clients that talk about that type of guilt and shame, let's say, not just when they're childhood, or maybe they're at, maybe they're 16 or maybe they're 26 and they have that type of guilt and shame that they feel. It's not uncommon for that to come bubbling up. And so we need, like I said, it sounds kind of weird, but we need guilt to let us know that we're not alone and there's other people. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I'm not saying it feels good. Like you know, we don't want to sit in it forever. But that first kind of guilt, if we kind of make it right and repair the relationship, usually we can move on from it fairly quickly. And so that is one of the first things that kids feel when we start talking about emotions. Let me stop here. Um, does that sometimes when I talk about this, there's questions, sometimes not. So does that kind of make sense? Talk to me about what you think, or if I need to explain that more. And I realize that what I'm talking about is pretty nuanced too, but in general, these are like kind of big markers that happen.
I have a question.
Hmm.
So when you say that like guilt is one of those lasting emotions that like kind of starts early, is shame also tied in with that, or do those start at different times and are they different to you?
So the second kind of guilt that I was talking about, the reason why it sticks with us is because of shame. So shame is one of those things that um, where we something something happens to us, but it's not because of us. It's because of someone else, right? That's a trauma or an abusive situation or just um, harsh discipline potentially with kids, things like that. That when we start to think more about, okay, there is something wrong with me. That's when guilt turns to shame. There's something wrong with me. I must be wrong. There's something going on with me. And it's not necessarily, especially in childhood, it's not necessarily something that a kid can put their finger on. It becomes potentially something that they think about every once in a while, and that can carry over in even into adulthood. So, does that make sense? Hopefully,
Yeah, thanks. I was curious if that second type of guilt you were really kind of leaning into shame. So that answered my question. Thank you.
yeah. So, um, and and like I said, depending on the situation that people live in and come from, um, different people handle guilt and shame different than other people too. There are studies that show some people handle it maybe in a more, I'm going to say healthy. I don't know if that's the best word, but maybe more healthy way to realize that, wait a minute, this is not my problem. This is someone else's issue. Like I didn't do anything. They did this kind of thing. But in childhood, that's really difficult to understand. Um, and I think one thing that is important to realize too is the first, I don't know, 8 or 9 years, kids are definitely sponge-like in their brains, neurologically speaking, for sure. They're taking in several things and they're learning several different things. As a matter of fact, the only other time that our brains are as sponge-like is in like middle adolescence, like 15, 16 through 20, 25 or so. It's probably the only other time that we're as most neurologically sponge-like. By the time we get 25 or 6, typically, it doesn't mean we can't change or change behavior or work through things. It's just that our brains aren't as sponge-like during those times. Um, but I want to talk about kind of what we're when I'm saying like, hey, when I start realizing there's other people around, a very important step that will become important for the rest of our lives is the ability to take perspective of other people. Like that perspective taking process um, when we begin to potentially start understanding, other people's thoughts and feelings. And that starts in childhood. Now, they're not experts of it. That's just when things start. If and when kids have trouble with that, which they do, um, sometimes they're more likely to appear more oppositional, um, and they have difficulty in certain relationships. It doesn't mean that they would necessarily be trapped there forever. It just means at that time, maybe they're having a little more trouble with it. And so, perspective taking is one piece of empathy, basically, that is a skill that you will build on as long as you want to build on it. I mean, you can build empathy skills for your whole life if you'd like. In other words, it's not a automatic behavior necessarily. It's skill based, that's actually good. There's a lot of things that start happening in childhood that are skill based, like perspective taking, how we think about others, how we think about ourselves, certain behaviors. I mean, those are skills that we can change and develop and grow in as we get older. The first part, or the first few years, obviously our parents have the biggest role in that, how they direct that. And then as we get into the later teen years and late adolescence and into young adulthood, we kind of take over and kind of take those responsibilities on. But there's a lot of skill building that starts in childhood. I'm talking about all these things, I realize, like kind of a 30,000-foot view on purpose, because I think it's important. Um, I don't think that anything that I'm talking about right now is like, I don't think it's new information. I mean, in my experience with this class and other classes, I mean, if you wanted to, besides the textbook that we have, if you wanted to, you could go find this information almost anywhere. I mean, you can find out lots and lots of information that's out there. How we apply it probably is what I think sets a clinician apart from just someone just studying information. How we take the information and how we apply it, um, those things become really important. So, um, there's a couple of things I want to talk about specifically. Looking at one thing in particular. Oh, there we go. Okay. Um, so, uh, kids are naturally curious and become more interested in, you know, how things happen or what's going on and why is that happening that way and what about this, um, and it can become uh, seem monotonous to parents or other adults. And it's part of what I was saying earlier about kind of the sponge-like nature of kids' brains. Part of it's a social interaction. They're interacting with people that they see as that would know answers to why is this happening? Why is this? How does this work? And why are you doing this? I've got a 5-year-old nephew that, um, when he's around and like I was over Thanksgiving, I was smoking a turkey and he kind of followed me around for a little while and probably asked 20 different questions about, smoking a turkey and, why do you do it that way? Why'd you put it there? Why does this happen? What's that in your hand? What are you looking at? I mean, that type of thing. That's a pretty normal part of childhood development. It's also kind of goes hand in hand with kids, you know, potentially like going off on their own and maybe getting into something they shouldn't be into, right? Like maybe they get into a certain room and mess something up or because they're curious about it, or maybe they go outside and get, really dirty, or, I mean, there's lots of things that happen that kids are normally naturally, they just kind of do. And so the one thing that I find, this is maybe the second kind of topic that I hear from parents, um, is uh, if parents see these curious behaviors as mischief, kind of mischief making, or uh, like making a mess, kind of you're doing this on purpose and you're into mischief and you're, you know, see it as a bad thing. Over time, kids can become or feel a little inferior because we're just kind of doing things that are natural. And then they're being told that what they're doing is not only is it not natural, you shouldn't be doing that. And you're actually, you know, maybe what's intimated is that you're doing something wrong all the time and you're actually doing it on purpose, let's say. Um, kids, like, there could be adults in certain kids' life that might intimate that, you know, these kids are manipulating the situation or they're doing certain things on purpose. And when you intimate that and say that to kids, eventually that's what they will become. Now, I'm not talking about if this happens once or twice. I'm talking about over time. Um, and that inferiority kind of area is where a lot of our own self-talk will happen, which how we, talk about ourselves. And we all, every human being, has self-talk that we say, to ourselves. And there's some people that say it out loud, but for the most part, it's inside of our head. And that self-talk, a lot of it, a lot of a lot of that comes from our childhood environment. Not necessarily only there. There's other things that could affect it for sure, like any kind of traumatic situation that someone might go through will affect it. Any type of difficulty that someone has, even if they're like 16 and they have a difficulty or 25, your self-talk can always be um, influenced for sure. But when we start thinking about how kids do self-talk, and if we're basically kind of treating kids like their natural curiosity is wrong, that becomes an issue. Now, what we're not saying is that they don't need boundaries or structure or, obviously, like with my nephew, I'm not going to say, I need you to go open the door to the smoker and pull the turkey out. I mean, you're going to have structure to their curiosity. Um, this was kind of a side note. My son and I were actually doing something in the yard over Thanksgiving, and there was a shovel out there, and my son was out digging, and my nephew went out there, and naturally he wanted to dig with the shovel, so we got him a little spade, and we said, hey, the only place you can dig is right here. This is our. We put like a little make believe circle, and that was fine. He knew where he should go and where he shouldn't, and if he got outside of it, we could say, hey, let's stay over here. So that we don't have to just allow any behavior that they're doing. We can put structure and boundaries around it for sure. But but if we don't allow them to be who they are, that can be a struggle that they might have like throughout their life. And keep in mind, I'm not no parent, no adult, no one's a robot. We all make mistakes and say the wrong thing sometimes or do the wrong thing sometimes with kids. That always happens. That's a given. Um, but if we do that, it's important to come back and repair um, that relationship. And that actually, there's a there's a fair amount of research that talks about repairing relationships can be one of the most uh, uh, one of the best experiences kids can have because it teaches them to repair relationships. And so, I know I'm talking a lot. I'm kind of going down a rabbit hole a little bit, but um, I see this a lot. parents, and I hear even language sometimes of parents that, that we just say sometimes, and not thinking that, this who kids are now are not who they're going to be. Kind of like teenagers, who they are now is not who they're going to be. And sometimes we get frustrated with some of that, but it's really important to just kind of understand where some of this is coming from. So, does that make sense? Hopefully, anybody have a question about that? Okay. 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 Let's take a little step back for a second. Um, there's a lot of there's been lots of debate about nature and nurture, and what's more genetic, what's more environmental. That debate's been going on for a long time. It's probably going to keep going on for a long time. The book talks about it for sure. And then out of that, you know, a lot of theories of human development kind of rose out of those discussions, like Piaget and Erikson, Vygotsky, like all these folks that kind of like we're trying to make sense of, why we do the things we do and how we develop and why and that type thing. Like even things like, you know, how we cognitively develop, like how do we think about things, and do we learn by being taught specifically? Do we learn by observing? Do we learn mostly in our environment? Is it a cultural thing that's passed down? There's all of these questions that kind of come from um, the different theories that try to answer those questions. And so, one of the things that I like to do is talk about, different characteristics that uh, that are influenced by, uh, let's say, culture. Um, like um, like things that maybe it's a personality characteristic, or it's um, it's a way that we talk to people or interact with certain people, or um, are we more shy in certain situations and things like that. So um, when Vygotsky came along, he he's one of the first ones to say, hey, let's think about, like, not just like all the information we have, especially from Piaget, that would say, um, there's stages, right? There's stages of development, and you have to finish one stage to get to the next. Vygotsky is like, well, I don't know if there's specific stages of development, but there seems to be like this zone of proximal development. In other words, in this area, this age of life, they're going to basically pick up these skills, or they're going to learn these things, and then they're going to enter into another zone and they're going to pick up these skills. And a lot of that um, is very much for him, very much counts on whatever the culture that someone's in. The teacher's kind of like a facilitator, not a director. Uh, they kind of guide these experiences. They actually kind of both agree about that. But when we think about different characteristics, um, uh, Vygotsky would say, hey, culture plays a massive role in how we develop as people, like the culture that we live in. Now, culture is a large word, so it could be ethnicity and gender, and could be, parts of the world we live in, could be language that we use, it could be things that we've passed down. Um, and so, one of the things I'd like for everyone to do, I'm going to break everyone into groups, probably like three or four folks in a group. Are there certain um, characteristics of people that are really impacted by culture? In other words, we kind of have these characteristics because of the culture we come from. Can you list 5 or 10 of those? And then on the flip side of that, are there 5 or 10 characteristics that maybe are not influenced by culture? Um, they don't get their influence from that. Um, and you can obviously talk about your own kind of beliefs because this is a nature nurture kind of discussion too. In other words, some people will be very adamant that certain um, personality characteristics, for example, are mainly genetic and they're passed down genetically. Others might say, well, wait a minute, what about these situations that you have people coming out of certain cultures and have those characteristics. I want you guys to discuss that. You should have. There's actually, I think there's a chart in the book kind of comparing like Piaget and Vygotsky, and there's lots of information about the nature nurture kind of this debate. Well, I'm not looking for like these are the right 5 or 10 answers. I really want you to talk more about your view of this nature nurture, but in terms of like how impactful is culture? What is culture's impact on these 5 or 10 things versus culture doesn't really play a role in any of these 5 or 10 things? So I'm going to give you a few minutes to do that, and then we'll come back and talk about those a little bit, and then we'll kind of move to the next area. So here in a second, you should see a little button there to jump into a group. You should see it now. All right. Hopefully it didn't cut too many people off. That's the only downside of Zoom breakout rooms. Sometimes it just ends all of a sudden. Love to hear what everyone talked about, and please feel free to unmute yourself and talk. It's just an open discussion.
I'm trying to turn on my video, but it says that you have us blocked from doing that.
I don't think so.
It says you cannot start your video because the host has stopped it.
Huh.
Anyway,
Try it now. Try it now.
all right. Awesome. I thought our group was really great. Those are some really difficult questions. Um, at first, I was trying to think about it from the perspective of what we're talking about, infancy, early childhood, and we started carrying through to all aspects. And the most difficult thing for us was the non-culture. And the only thing I could come up with, but some of that was influenced by my time as a medic and a firefighter, was the innate things that we're born with that that kind of grow, which the core emotions of happiness, sadness, anger, things like that. And kind of where I was talking about that was I've run on these kids that were abused and in the worst absolute situations ever, and they were still laughing and just were able to tap into their joy, and they weren't angry. And what I had talked about with our group and what we had talked about was as time goes on, then as we start to learn more from the culture and we gain more wounds, and it's not surprising that, oh, you're in a terrible environment, you should be pissed off and whatever. I don't know, but it was a very in-depth question, so I appreciate that.
Yeah, especially at 6 o'clock at night.
I was also in Carrie's group, and some of the things that we talked about in there, when we're talking about like things that that might be influenced by through culture, were qualities like academicals that might have been put on us through culture. Gender roles came up too. How our culture values trust as a value in itself, competence and humor as well. And then, back to what Carrie's saying about the non-culture impacts, core emotions came up, and then physical characteristics came up because that's just kind of innately who you are. So we were kind of getting into like who you innately are, the things that you are that can't be changed. And what we really got where the conversation got kind of convoluted is because you're like, you can make an argument for both. You could literally say, I don't like what my physical characteristics are, and I'm going to change those. Or, there was another one that slipped, but also one that came up for me also separately was, intellectual abilities being a cultural thing. Like if you're a gifted child, well, culture really has no impact on that. You're either gifted or you're not, kind of thing. So that was some of the stuff that we were talking about.
Gotcha. Okay, good.
Yep, Sabrina brought up work ethic. That was the other one.
Okay.
So in ours, we talked for a minute. I have three biological children and two adopted. And we adopted my brother-in-law's kids, so I know their biological parents really well. So it's interesting to see that some of the characteristics we see, like, are for sure nature, because all five of my boys kind of have the same vibe on them. And then on others, it feels like, nope, I've seen that, and I know that one's your dad, and that one's me, and that one's your biological dad. So I feel like in our house, I distinctly see where some of it's nature and some of its nurture on a regular basis.
Yeah, sure. You have your own research study in front of you.
Hmm.
Good, good. Anybody else?
I wanted to jump in. One thing that I thought was interesting was we were talking about rites of passage in a way and how that changes over time, like quinceañeras, kind of saying like you're coming into womanhood now, or different cultures have different rites of passage for men. Some people don't have as many rites of passage to say, okay, now you've become a man or a woman or whatever. And so I thought that was interesting, and that kind of led to a conversation about like um, how over time the idea of when you start a family or when you break away from your family changes. Like if you look at ancient times, people were having children when they were 14 because they only lived to be 30. But if someone were to do that today, that would seem like developmentally inappropriate almost. So I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah, yeah. Good, good. Anyone else?
Our group focused more on sociocultural influences, not just from between countries, but also just between regions of the US or states, how Texas is its own country, and the differences that it shares with other states. There's a lot of pride in the state. It's pretty impressive. But then also how religion plays a role in all, as well as technology, and how it really does mold a person and change even like kids these days, kids, uh, young adults and children. They are born with a cell phone in their hand and this technology that just allows immediate gratification. And as much as I wanted to say the kids, I was just like, no, we do this too as adults. Anyone who has gotten used to this technology, it's all about immediate gratification. It also does stem out on narcissistic tendencies, which aren't so healthy. There are positives, but yeah, so that's pretty much what we were talking about.
Gotcha. Good. Okay. That's a whole class, what you're talking about, Christy. We can spend a lot of time talking about that. Yeah. I think the main goal of some of the discussions is for us to talk about some of these things. And these are parts of what you're going to be thinking as a clinician when you're working with people, because you're going to be gathering information about you know, where people come from and behaviors that they've had or things they'd like to change, and you know, whether their influence is, and depending on the age, some of that matters more than others. But these are all things that are important to think about. And I want to shift gears to something that I think is, at least for me as a clinician, is extremely important for everyone from childhood through adulthood, and that's like being able to regulate your emotions, which is a little bit of a misnomer. But when kids are able to manage their emotions better, they typically have better social lives for the most part, and they tend to uh, help other people do the same. Now, let me be specific about a couple of things. There's and we're going to talk about this a lot in adolescence, but if we spend our time coaching emotional regulation, then we'll get a certain product in the end of that. If we spend our time dismissing emotions, then we'll get a certain outcome or product from that. And that the term emotional coaching has kind of come along now in the last few years. And some people love it, some people don't. It just kind of just depends on where you stand on emotions. It's not it's not abnormal now, in my experience. It's not abnormal now to have, let's say, folks that are 30 and under be able to kind of name emotions fairly easily and be able to walk through them. Doesn't mean other people can't. It just means that was something that becoming aware of emotions has played a role in our society, in education, in pretty much all aspects of our world, becoming emotionally aware, which I think is a good thing. I think that's actually a positive thing. The issue that we have now is not necessarily being able to like be aware or name an emotion. It's what do we do now? What do we do? Because just naming it and being aware of it is only the first step. And so one of the things that I would encourage everyone to think about, whether you're doing school counseling or LPC, LMFT, or you're just, you're going to work with people in general and you're taking this as an elective. One of the things I would encourage everyone to do is think through and research and look through how regulating emotions, like how to do it with people, because everyone learns how to do it growing up, for good or bad. And where would we learn that?
Maybe modeling, parental modeling.
Yeah, kids don't know anything, right? When we're born, we don't know how to talk or walk or turn over or eat or anything. We don't know anything, right? So we have to learn it somewhere. And emotional regulation is no different. So our first experience with emotional regulation happens where? In our families, for the most part. And I'm not trying to throw people under the bus here, okay? This is not what this is about. This is just what happens. And it doesn't mean that if someone didn't learn very well, that later in their life they couldn't learn how to do it better. People can learn how to regulate emotions. I think one of the things that's interesting is that we don't always do well as human beings. We sometimes don't do well with like messing up or failing or not doing something right, or we don't always do well with that. And the problem with that is that's kind of how we learn, or that's one way. It's one of the biggest ways we learn. And if we grow up in places where we think we have to do everything exactly right the first time, then we're growing up in a very specific type of environment that's teaching us very specific things about not just our behaviors, but how we feel about our behavior. And that can be very important. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because I think I think we sometimes struggle with this idea of failure, and and failure is actually kind of important to learning. For example, and this is kind of a small example. If we think about kids that are learning to walk, most of the time they don't start walking, they roll over, and then maybe they reach for something, and then maybe they get up and rock, and then maybe they crawl. But when they first start taking their first steps, most of the time, what do? They fall down and get back up, and I mean, they're going to fall down. I mean, that's just part of the growth process, right? Riding a bike, same thing. I mean, we teach someone to ride a bike and we put them on training wheels, and then take the training wheels off. It's highly likely they're going to freeze or fall down. I mean, something. They're not always necessarily going to learn it the first time. Now, obviously, some people have better coordination than others, and all those things. But if we have certain social situations, or certain situations at school, or certain situations in families where someone doesn't handle something right, or they make a mistake, or they don't get something right, if we act like, you have to be perfect, basically, we have a fair amount of people in our world right now thinking that basically, perfectionism is kind of like an attainable thing. And that's not really true. But those messages get kind of passed down. I'll give you an example. Clinically, I've worked with a lot of different people, and I've worked with a lot of people on like black and white thinking. Like it's either right or it's all wrong, and it's either I do it perfect or I don't do it kind of thinking. And there's been times where I've asked, now this is going to sound strange, but where I've asked clients to pick up a pen or something and drop it on the floor. And they have trouble doing that because it's a mistake kind of thing. Like it doesn't feel right. And when we live and create those environments with children, then that's the environment they'll kind of come out on. And again, I'm not throwing people under the bus. We all have behaviors that come from somewhere. Our parents have behaviors that come from somewhere. Their parents have behaviors that come from somewhere. This is not about, we need to go back and change everything. You're going to have clients that you're going to run into that never really learned how to regulate their emotions, never really learned that it's okay to mess up or make mistakes, and black and white thinking is not necessarily helpful. This is something that's going to happen a lot. It's going to happen over and over. Just social media's message is perfection. Just that message is difficult for some people. So this is going to happen. These are clinical things that are going to happen when you're working with people. And some people will be better at it than others, but the most people that we get in the therapy setting are people that maybe have struggle with that. I work with plenty of adults right now that I say struggle with anger. They don't have any problem getting angry. They just don't know what to do about it. And a lot of that goes back to how they learned how to deal with it when they were growing up. And so regulating emotions is one of the first kind of big building blocks to a kind of a peaceful life. And when we do it well with kids, not perfectly, when we do it well, they just seem to adjust better. And again, I'm not saying that something can't come along for all of us at any time in our life and kind of throw us off and set us back. That can definitely happen for sure. That's kind of a different conversation. So that part of like emotional development is super important. One of the things I'm going to do, I think I'll do it next time. I don't have time today. I want to go through like just what emotions are and how we have them and what they look like and things like that. I'm going to go over that at the very first of our class next time. But regulating emotions is such a fascinating subject to me because I don't work with children anymore. I used to a long time ago, but I work only with adults, and plenty of adults have trouble regulating their own emotions right now in our world. And it's kind of fascinating to watch. I think one of the reasons why some kids are delayed in their maturity is the adults in their world should act like adults, so they want to be an adult. That actually helps them. And I think for some of them, that's not necessarily happening. And we're going to talk, like I said, we're going to talk about this a lot more in adolescence because it becomes more pronounced. Because in adolescence, you get all of a sudden, you have a human being that can not only think certain things, they start saying it. Right. And they're very much more, upfront and asking questions and confrontational. And so that becomes a different discussion. Kids maybe potentially aren't as confrontational for the most part as a teenager might be. Does that all make sense, hopefully?
Yeah, this is Nisha, and I was just thinking about what you said in regards to perfection and social media. And I think as I got older in life, I realized the call for perfection from my parents, and with social media, it kind of just got worse with trying to achieve that perfection. So definitely giving yourself grace, and knowing there's no true perfection really is helpful to know.
Yeah, I think yeah, I find this what I'm about to say controversial with some people. The nicer we are to ourselves, the more highly functional we'll be. Which sounds right when you think about it, but people push against that because it sounds like the anti. It sounds like it shouldn't be that way, and so um, I think that's important. And these are just some things that happen. If we flip this around and say, well, you know, there's plenty of things that kids learn in childhood that will be very useful to them that they learn from their parents and other adults. Someone mentioned like work ethic or working hard. That's a learned behavior as well. Um, Things like how you talk to people, like how you treat other people. That's a learned behavior. If you do that well in front of your kids, they will start picking up on that. There's lots of things that can be learned that are very helpful to kids that aren't bad. Even even in situations that seem kind of dark. People. I think Carrie was talking about this earlier. There's plenty of studies that talk about resilience, for example, and there's plenty of people that come out of very difficult childhood situations that are extremely resilient people that I think can be very, it's very important because our resilience is kind of what kind of keeps us going sometimes, especially when things get hard or something happens that's really hard. That resilience piece, the higher that resilience is, or the more the more you're able to tap into it, the quickly you move through something and move forward with something. So resilience becomes very, very important. And you can teach resilience with people too. And you can, a lot of times it's just a matter of highlighting it for them, just so they can see that what they've actually overcome. because most of us don't think about stuff like that. For example, there's a exercise I do with students when we're in practicum 2, which is kind of the end of the LPC program, that we talk about this specifically. And I think it's good from time to time for all of us to look back and say, in spite of these situations or these circumstances, I was able to accomplish these things, whatever those things are. I think that's very helpful for people to realize about themselves, because the
What do
things
you
we
think?
accomplish are black, they're black and white. Like, we can give examples of those things. So sorry, Misha, I didn't mean to cut you off.
I was just thinking, by you saying that, I was wondering, what do you think is that differentiating factor from those who maybe grow up in a toxic environment and then replicate that environment, and then the other ones that grow up in that same environment but do the total opposite of the parents, or
Yeah. So let me talk about a couple of things. First of all, it doesn't have to be toxic as in like low socioeconomic status. It could be extremely wealthy people, families, and they have trouble with this too. Like, this doesn't necessarily, like, resiliency is not necessarily just for a certain ethnicity or a certain socioeconomic status or a certain gender. There are some studies about like brain development, for example. In the addiction world, they say hard brain and soft brain, which sounds kind of harsh, but a hard brain is one that's just, they really have trouble being resilient. They're just kind of set and stuck. A soft brain is like a little more flexible, a little more able to work through something, a little more able to figure it out. And so some of that could be potentially genetic. That could be something that's passed down. Some of that could be that they had someone in their life somewhere that was just encouraging to them, or that said, "Hey, I know these things are happening, but look what you're able to do." My kids are, grew up with a therapist dad, so there's a lot of discussion around our house. They get tired of me, for sure. But there's times when my son was struggling with something, and we were just talking about things in general, and he worked really hard for this. He's in the band. He's a senior, and he worked really hard for this certain position in the regional band, and he got first chair out of like 60 kids, and he couldn't believe it at first, and it kind of sunk in. And then when he was talking to me about it, he's like, "I just, 99% of what I did was great, but there's 1% I messed up on, and I know what I did wrong." And, which is a normal. It's normal for human beings to do that, to think about the 1%. And all I said was, "What about the 99%? Which one is better to focus on?" Because we don't want to just act like we don't need to grow. So that 1% of growth is fine. Find out what you did wrong and work on it for sure. But don't forget the 99% is what, got you where you're at. That's made up all that work you did over the holidays when people were out doing stuff and you were in the band hall. I mean, there's a lot of things that come with that. And so it's important, I think, as clinicians sometimes to point out those things to people. In narrative therapy, it's called exceptions. When someone's going down a road and they're only seeing the negative of something, you point out exceptions of when things were better, or when they didn't do those things, or hey, when they made better choices. You point those out and you say, "Well, hey, what was different here versus here?" And I think that in childhood, if you have people in your life that do that with you, even in whatever the situation, you have a better shot at resilience in those situations. Eventually, though, it does become on you. Like, eventually, as people, we have to take responsibility for our own growth, which we'll talk about when we get to adulthood. I think that's very important. And that's a fine line, I think, sometimes between everything that happened to me is because all the things that happened in my past, versus everything that happened in my past doesn't define who I am in the future. And that's a very fine line for some people. It's hard for some people to wrap their head around. I don't know if I answered your question at all, but that's kind of what. There's a lot of resilience research out there. a ton of it. You can read a lot about it. I think even Brene Brown in her, I think it's the first book she wrote about shame and guilt. I can't remember. She talks
I
about
read that one. Mm-hmm.
she talks about resilience, path of resilience.
That's a
Anyway,
great. Thank you.
yeah, no problem. Any other questions about anything?
I have a quick question. When you're talking about soft brain, hard brain, is that different from plasticity?
That's what plasticity is really.
Okay. I
Everyone
just wanted to
has,
make sure.
yeah, everybody's brain is elastic and can change even into our 80s. We know that because we've seen functional MRIs of people. Now, I'm not saying it's easy, depending on what the behavior is and depending on our age and how serious we are about changing something. It can be very hard. This is fascinating because I've just been studying this recently about elasticity in our brain. There's a piece in our brain, in the anterior piece back in the back, that is basically kind of where willpower comes from for people. And we, you can look at studies of like certain kind of athletes and certain kind of distance runners and certain people that have found success in different industries. That part of their brain is larger than someone that maybe is struggling and is maybe not as active, let's say, or like physically active, or maybe struggling just with their weight or just with changes in their life. And the difference is when you do things you don't want to do, that part of your brain grows. Now, it doesn't just take one time. We're talking about, over time, because our brains don't change slow. When you don't do the things, or when you put those things off, that part shrinks. So there's been actually quite a bit of study into this piece of the brain that talks about willpower. And one of the reasons why I'm bringing this up is you'll work with plenty of people that are struggling with motivation, or getting things done, or don't know why they can't do certain things. And sometimes maybe people are taking on too much at a time, but a lot of times it's that part of their brain they just need to exercise. Think about it like a muscle. The more you do it, the bigger it grows and the stronger it grows. But it takes time. Like this is the time of year where a lot of people decide to go to the gym or start a new diet or whatever it is, like make whatever changes that they want to do, and it lasts like 2 or 3 weeks. The irony of any change brain wise, like if we change our diet, let's say, for example, if we do something that changes our diet and we follow through with it, let's say for 6 months, that's awesome. It takes 2 to 3 years for it to actually become a habit. That's how long it takes for our brain to change from the old way that we were looking at our diet, let's say. And that's just an example. I mean, there's other examples. Like any kind of habit that you want to form, it takes effort and time to do it over and over and over. For good ones and bad ones, right? That's just kind of how it works. Now I know we're getting off on a rabbit trail a little bit here, but does that all make sense? Hopefully. I gave you a lot more than you wanted, Carrie. That's probably a lot more answer you were looking for. Okay. Here's going to be our next. Get over here. There we go. I would say the topic that I hear the most when working with, and like I said before, I mainly work with adults now, individuals and couples. I would say that 95% of the people I work with, they bring up some aspect of parenting in some way. And that's been the case for a long time now. which I think makes sense because that's a big, part of people's life. If you go out right now and Google parenting books or parenting resources, like if you Google it, you'll get millions of links to it. So it's interesting because we have a lot of information in our world right now about parenting, for example, things to do, not do. We have lots of podcasts about it now. There's different Instagram and TikTok personalities that talk about it. I mean, there's lots of information now. The book talks specifically about four parenting styles. And what I'd like for everyone to do is kind of look at those, and you can find them in your. I'm not exactly sure where this is. Baumride's parenting styles: authoritarian, authoritative, neglectful, and indulgent. Those four, and you can look if you just call it up on the internet. You can find usually colorful little charts about them. What I'd love for everyone to talk about is two things. What parenting style do you most relate to as growing up? Like, I think this is what was done with me. And do you think that one's what you would do now? Or is there something you would do different? And use you can kind of look at your book and kind of look at the different definitions of those and kind of talk through that. And I'm going to give you a little bit of time to do this, but I want you to kind of focus on mainly, for the most part, that authoritarian and authoritative parenting styles are probably the two that, for the most part, we resonate with. For the most part, doesn't mean we don't resonate with being, having neglectful or indulgent situations. But I'd like for you to kind of look at those and just talk through. Hey, here's what I resonate with. I don't think my parents were neglectful at all. I don't think they were indulgent. I think my parents were kind of a blend of authoritarian and authoritative at times, depending on the situation. But it's also a different thing. Like in the 80s, we were just like feral kids. We just ran around. There was no adults anywhere ever, and so it's just a totally different time. It's not bad or good. It's just different. And so, but I think my parents kind of vacillated between authoritarian and authoritative until they got divorced. Once they got divorced, I became more of a parent, not to them, but just on my own. Like I kind of was on my own a little bit more. Some of that was because I chose that. Some of that was just a situation. So we all have different situations that we come from. And in order to work with people, we have to know kind of where we come from. That helps us because we're going to work with people that come from similar situations. It's going to trigger us in a way. We just need to know that. So look at those four different styles. Talk about those. Hey, what do you resonate with? What things stick out to you? And like I said, I'm going to give you a little bit of time to do that. I'm going to change the groups around a little bit because we had some folks jump out. So I'm going to shuffle the groups a little bit. All right, there you go. You should see the join button there on your screen. All right. Welcome back. I'm going to there. We're gonna shift gears. We're gonna talk about the parenting style. I'm gonna save that till next class. because I'm going to ask some other questions about it as we move forward. I don't want to run out of time tonight to talk about the exam or any other questions about it. So this is a great time. I'm just going to open it up if you have questions about the exam. Let me just give a little bit of information about it. To the exam is web based, so there's a link on Moodle you'll click, and it'll take you to the website's called Classmarker, and basically you'll just create an account like your name, last name, and like a user name and password. You'll click on that and you'll start the exam. The exam is technically 4 hours long, but you probably won't need that long. If you decide like on Friday you want to jump on and create your account and start the exam, but then you want to jump off, just make sure you log off. It'll stop you wherever you stopped. It'll save your place, and the time will stop too. And then when you log back on, let's say Sunday or Monday or whenever, you can pick right back up where you left off. So the only problem that sometimes students run into is if they don't log off, because the time will keep going and it'll basically kick you out before you're actually finished. So make sure when you log off, that when you want to take a break, just log off. You can use your notes, you can use the book. It's only 25 questions, so it's not super long. And what'll happen is I'll get an email with the grade, and you'll actually get your score right then. And if you missed any, it'll tell you which ones. You don't need to screenshot it or send it to me. I get the email with your finished exam. And then because it's not linked directly to Moodle, I have to manually add the grades in to Moodle. So you might jump on the grade book on Moodle and see no grade, and then that freaks people out. And then they'll send me a screenshot. Just know that when everyone's done, so probably Thursday and Friday next week, or the week after the exam, is when I'll enter all the grades in. So you won't see a grade automatically, but whatever grade that Classmarker gives you is the grade that you'll get. I think that makes sense. Any questions about that part?
It multiple choice or
Yeah,
when?
all multiple choice. Yep.
Okay.
It'll look just like the study guide, like suspiciously similar, like exactly the same questions on purpose.
So
I had
can
a
we ask
question.
you about some of those questions?
You can. Yeah,
Like,
you
for
can.
example, fuzzy trace theory was not in the book.
Yeah. If it, I'm editing this exam all the time, so if it's not in the book, don't worry about it. It won't be on the exam.
But now I'm curious as to what it is. I mean, Google has an answer, but
What'd Google say? I love to
well,
hear what Google says. This is gonna be fun.
because it was AI generated.
Yeah.
I had it marked because I was so confused.
If you don't see something in the book that's on the study guide, don't worry about it being on the exam because it won't be.
Okay. Uh, Google or AI said that it's a theory of memory and decision making that explains how people process information and make judgments.
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
correct-ish.
That sounds right.
Okay.
Yeah. That's an interesting name. And there might be some questions. I think I got all these. There might be some questions in there that either there's a question and no answers, or there's answers with no questions. I think I got all those, but there might be. If there are, just disregard those two. This is my fifth edition of this exam. So every time we change editions, I go in and edit the study guide, and sometimes I just miss stuff.
I thought it was a great way to go along with reading the material.
Mhm.
It helped me to focus on things that you were really wanting us to know, because that's
Yeah,
pretty overwhelming. It's a lot of information.
yeah, that's a lot. It's almost like I know what I'm doing. I think it's so. I learned this from an old professor I had in my PhD program, where we had 100 question midterms and finals, and the week before he would go through the whole midterm and final with us word by word. Like he would just show it to us, and we'd go through the whole thing. And he didn't care if we took notes and copied, but I can still remember most all the things we learned. Like the goal of this class is to learn, right? Not fail or, I know everyone wants a grade. I get it. Everyone wants an A. I get that. I get that part. But, as long as you learn, that's what matters to me. So we used to do a final. I don't do the final anymore. I just do the paper. And so there's not a final exam. I think a couple of people messaged me about that. There's not a final exam. There's just a final paper, which some of you have emailed me or messaged me about some of your topics. I'm looking forward to reading some of them. They sound good. Any other test exam questions?
I had a question regarding the research paper.
Mhm.
Is there an outline or anything that I'm missing on Moodle that tells you kind of what topic you're supposed to work towards?
So there's two things on Moodle. There's a description of the actual assignment, and then I put an example of someone's actual paper, um, especially for organizational purposes. The student did a really good job kind of organizing it, I thought. So you can use that. You can copy their pattern, how they organized it.
But more regarding the topic that we choose.
Yeah, that's up to you, right? So you pick a life stage, whatever you want to research. You pick an issue or disorder, whichever one you want to research that's in that life stage. And then you also are looking for treatments for whatever that disorder is in that life stage. Yeah. Most people pick stuff that they're either already have been interested in, or sometimes people pick things they don't know anything about, but most people pick things they're already they already they already know a little bit about and they want to know more about.
So I just want to make sure I'm clear. So you said if the answer is not in the book, then don't worry about that on the exam, as well as is it possible, like if the answer in the book might be the numbers are kind of similar but not
Yeah,
all the way exact,
that's right. Yeah, that's right.
would those be on the test, or if the numbers are different then it's not going to be on the test?
No, those won't be on the test.
Okay.
Yeah.
Will the test be, is it just going to be jumbled up out of order, or does it go in sequential order?
I think it's in order.
Okay,
I'm not 100% sure.
gotcha.
I can't remember. I feel like it's in order though. And some chapters will have more questions than others too. It's only 25 questions. It's only 25 points, y'all. So just remember that.
I was actually curious about the RCRs that we've been doing. I mean, based on what you've seen, are we doing it right? I mean, like,
Yeah.
is it too much? Is it too little?
No, and if something's wrong, I tell people, like there's been some that have been wrong. I've told, hey, do it this way, do these things, change it this way. If I just say, hey, good job, or if I make a comment about a, reflection part or something that you wrote, then you're fine. You're doing what you need to be doing. Um, if there's specific feedback that I need to give, I'll give that to you. So otherwise everything would be fine. So if you don't see anything that says, hey, change this or do this different, then you should be good.
Okay, thank you.
Should be
Appreciate
good.
it.
Hmm. Yeah, I think the biggest thing is at the beginning, the first one, making sure you do two of them, and then after that, they excuse me, they as the topics change, as you read through the book and you start doing some that are different, that's when I start getting all kinds of different ones, right? Like Mark might do something from chapter 10 and Christy might do something from chapter 13. I mean, they're all different kind of, and so that's why I want you to, the big things as we move forward is just make sure you label them, and everyone's doing that. I think everyone's doing a good job. Y'all, I'll say this, your class is probably one of the first classes that's done it the best, if I'm being honest.
So just to
So
clarify, we do two RCRs per assignment, and you want us to submit those via email to you
they're on
and
Moodle. You put
then
them on Moodle. There's a
put
place
them
to
on.
there's a place to drop them in Moodle.
Okay, because I
Yeah.
think I did that wrong.
Yeah, you drop it in Moodle.
Okay.
There's a place to upload your assignment there.
Okay. And then the second part of it is to answer the question on the forum.
Right.
Okay, because I don't think I did that on the second one. So can I go back and do that now?
Sure. Yeah, for
Awesome.
sure.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Mhm.
I kind of got a little freaked out because after the break, I logged back in and I think it had us at week 5. Um, and so when I was doing the RCR, I wasn't sure what chapter to do. So I did it, I think, for the week 5 reading. I think it was chapter 11. And then I went back and did it again for chapters 2 and 3 and removed the 11. So I'm not sure if I did that right.
You can do it for any chapter. It doesn't matter where they come from. That reading list is just for you, just to follow if you want.
Okay.
And I realize that this semester is weird because we had that break, so it throws everything off. Like throws all the timing off of everything. So, and I think you only have one more of these, right? I think there's only 3. Am I saying this right? I think there's a 4. I can't remember. Last semester, I think I did 3. Anyway, one thing that we're going to do next class is we're going to do a case study together too, and that'll be like an extra credit thing. Like if I'll put you in groups like we did tonight, like breakout groups, and you'll work through the case study together, and then we'll go over it together as a class. And then one person from the group will just turn it into me, like with everyone's name on it. You'll just turn it into me, and everyone will get extra credit for that. So we're going to do that next class. So hopefully people watching the recording will hear that. That'll be, and I started doing these case studies about 2 years ago. Because we got a lot of feedback from our students as they left the program that they wish we would have done more simulated therapy if we could. So this is just an attempt to do some of that, start doing some of that now, just to give people some experience. And these are real cases. These are like some of my old cases. So it's like real things. It's not like stuff I made up. So we'll do that next time. Any other questions about anything?
Where are the recordings found?
So like tonight, you'll see on this week, it'll say recording, class recording in bold. And then you should be able to click it and it takes you to my YouTube channel basically, and you should see it there. Yeah. Give me like a day to put the recording up. It takes, excuse me, it takes a little bit of time to upload it and everything. All right. Now everyone can go do something else or whatever, go to sleep or I don't know, do laundry or if you have another class, like read, I don't know, do something. My wife's taking the lifespan class right now at a university, and she wants me to help her, and I told her I'm not going to. She's mad at me.
That should be a benefit.
I'm like, no, man, I had to learn this on my own. You'll learn this for yourself. I'll end up helping her. I'm sure.
To her.
The problem is that she won't. We don't learn the same. Let me just put it that way. So there's things we don't do well together that we stay away from, and this might be one of them. But I'll help her if she needs it. All right. So now, our next class, I believe, is like the 25th, maybe. Yeah. So January 25th. So that's a week from. Is that a week from Saturday? I think that's a week from Saturday. It's hard to believe January's like coming to a close. So not this Saturday, but the next. We'll get back on our Saturday meetings. And obviously, if you have questions, let me know. And I do try to get back to you like within a day, as quick as I can. The exam will be open by noon on Friday, and you can take it then. And good luck, and I'll see everybody on the 25th.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.